You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. You can make this possible. All 26 members of the Louisville Metro Council voted yesterday to pass a ban on no-knock warrants. The measure, known as Breonna's Law, is named after Breonna Taylor, who died in a police raid on her apartment in March. Joining me right now, one of the council members who pushed the bill forward is Councilwoman Barbara Sexton Smith. Councilwoman, glad to have you on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Obviously, this is unfortunate. She died as a result. But these are sort of the type of changes that Black Lives Matter protesters and others wanted to see before somebody died. And are you hopeful that other city councils will be proactive and then not require a Breonna Taylor to die to stop these warrants?
Well, Roland, absolutely. We're going to be proactive. And on the 3-month anniversary, which was March 12th, that was the day here in Louisville, Kentucky, that the 5 no-knock search warrants were issued, and some of those were executed. And during the execution of one of those, as now the entire world knows, our Breonna Taylor was killed whilst resting in her very own home and unarmed. So 3 months later, my message to the grassroots and to the other cities around the nation, this has to start at the local level. And as you have stated, 26 members of our bipartisan Metro Council here in Louisville, Kentucky, voted unanimously to ban no-knock warrants. And Roland, we took it a step further. I don't know if you've been able to read the law that we passed last night. It's just a simple 4-page ordinance, and the 5th page was just for signatures only. And included in this banning no-knock warrants, we lay out and specify what shall be done in the execution of all search warrants. And then we went as far as to include what shall be done in the use of executing a search warrant, how the officers must have their operating body cameras on them, and they must be activated. And we went as far as to say those cameras have to be activated 5 minutes before the execution of the search warrant begins while you're on the premises, and they must remain activated 5 minutes after the completion of the execution of all search warrants.
That point is important because we had the president of the Louisville City Council on when David McAtee was shot and killed. And one of the things that he told us then was that officers that night did not have their body cameras on, which led the mayor to fire the police chief. But what he also said is that the problem in the Breonna Taylor case, that the supervisor never updated the warrant. How did 2 months go by and you don't even update it? You don't even check. That's kind of basic.
Right. So what happened, and it has, in God's great big world, a lot of things surpass all understanding. And so many things fell in place and were not done since January of this year, 2020, that took us to that night when Breonna was killed in the wee hours of the morning on March 13th. And what we learned was the officers that were requesting the judge to sign those 5 no-knock warrants on March 12th, they were using information that they had gathered over the last couple of months. For example, they had written that they were looking for a particular automobile, and they associated that automobile with Breonna Taylor. She did not operate and own that automobile at the time of the execution of her warrant. And then they were looking for a particular individual that was not even at the address where Breonna happened to be living at the time. And then the other thing, Roland, that troubled me so much when I saw the copies of the search warrants was that they used a cut and paste method. And you could see where they took language and just pasted it, the same identical language, in a number of those search warrants. So it wasn't any specificity of any great measure that could be relied on, especially when they're going to go do a no-knock warrant, which what officers tell me, and many have told me in the last several weeks, that the most dangerous moments in a police officer's career are at that moment when they're getting ready to breach that door and go into a space without knocking and identifying. So, Roland, the whole objective of Breonna's law here in Louisville, Kentucky is to save lives. We want to save the lives of our citizens and save the lives of our law enforcement officers also.
Well, to your point there, I mean, Kenneth Walker, of course, he responded. He
Right.
was a lawful gun owner, and he's thinking somebody's breaking in to where he lives with Breonna Taylor. It could be a home invasion, and responds. And then what does the DA do? The cops arrest him and charge him with attempted murder, and he was trying to defend, not knowing who the hell was breaking in. And this is what is so frustrating for the public is
Right.
that, and this is the argument that I make, that the actions of a police officer can end in death. This is not a sanitation worker. This is not somebody filling potholes. This is not somebody who is working at Parks and Recreation. Police officers have guns. They can lawfully kill people. You know what? If I got into an accident because a city truck hit my car, more than likely I'm going to survive it. Breonna Taylor can't come back. And this is where police officers have to understand why the public says we hold you to a higher standard, because death is involved.
Right. And you mentioned Kenneth Walker, and I think it's always important to mention Mr. Walker's name because he did what anyone I know would do. All right. And Roland, I can't speak for you, buddy, and I do not own a gun. But
Same here.
I did, and if someone were to break into my home in the middle of the night, I would want to protect everyone in my home. So Kenneth Walker did the thing that any sane individual would do. And do you realize that when he fired his weapon pointing down, which tells me, with what little I know about firing a weapon, is he was not firing to kill. Mr. Walker was firing to stop whomever was coming in. And so the officer that was struck with the one bullet fired, he was struck in his leg. And then now we know that Breonna Taylor took 8 bullets. I don't know if you know yet, but
wow.
The incident report was released just yesterday here in Louisville. It was a big day for us because prior to our unanimous vote, the incident report was released. And in that report, it states that Breonna Taylor was unharmed, not injured.
Are you serious? 8 bullets?
It states she was not injured. How can that be? She took 8 bullets and she died on the floor of the apartment where she lived.
And see, this is also the last question here for me. This is the other thing that I keep saying. You have officers who will willingly and knowingly lie on reports, lie in testimony. That right there by itself is an abomination. How can a woman be shot 8 times and then the report is no big deal?
That's the question. And, it's, the old cliche we talk about, that's a $64,000 question. Let me tell you something, Roland. For me, the question you just asked, that's a 401-year-old question. Because putting 100% of our attention as a nation on all law enforcement and trying to put them all in the same group, I think it'd be a tragedy because there's a lot of other institutional oppression and racism that is rampant throughout our nation. And yes, we need to have law enforcement reform. At the same time, we need to lift up the law enforcement officers who are the good guys, the good women who are trying to protect us. And one other piece of information I wanted to share with you tonight is we also know there were approximately 100 officers at one time or another on the scene at Breonna Taylor's home where she died. And to our knowledge, not one bit of body camera footage. That is why we put that in this ordinance. And we use the word shall throughout this ordinance. Another important component of this ordinance here in Louisville regulating the all search warrants is that how that warrant will be executed. So any search warrant from now on in Louisville, there has to be a knock loud enough on the entry door that the occupants inside can reasonably hear that. The second component is there has to be an announcement by the officers that it's police and their purpose loud enough that it can reasonably be heard by anybody inside. And thirdly, and very important, absent exigent circumstances, after the loud knock and the loud announcement, the officers must wait a minimum of 15 seconds or a reasonable period, whichever is greater, before entering. And I think this is key language to put in place. It'll
Absolutely.
save lives if we do this together.
Louisville Council. Go ahead.
Yes,
Go ahead.
And I was going to say, this. I wanted you to know that it is formally part of our law now and part of the Louisville Metro Code of Ordinances. This shall be known legally as Breonna's Law. That's not something that we just call it as its other name, because the one thing that Breonna Taylor's mother, her name is Tamika Palmer, has asked us all to do is say her name. Say her name. And when I heard her mother on television, I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I heard Miss Palmer say, please say my daughter's name, Breonna Taylor. My husband looked at me and he said, you need to get that ordinance written, work with Jessica Green, and you need to name it Breonna's Law. And that is how we came here. We're going to remember her name, and she lived her life saving other lives as an emergency technician and a first responder when the global pandemic hit. And we're going to live our lives saving lives and fighting for her. Yes, we will. So she's going to save folks even in her passing.
Councilwoman Barbara Sexton Smith, we certainly appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Roland.
All right, folks, let's go to our panel. Rob Richardson, he is the host of Disruption Now podcast. Also, we have here Dr. Niambe Carter, Howard University, Department of Political Science. And we'll be joined a little bit later by Leah Wright Regier, Associate Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. I want to go to you first, Dr. Carter. This is, first of all, Black Lives Matter Louisville also played a huge role. So we want to shout them out for making this possible as well. It took activism in the streets as well as politicians in the suites to make it happen. But this is what needs to be happening across the country. All of these different cities. And this is the point I keep making. We can't just focus on federal legislation. Okay? That has to go through the House and the Senate. Cities and the Senate. City councils can act right now to implement exactly what they've done here with Breonna's Law.
Absolutely, Roland. And this is why it's so important to pay attention to what happens in our localities and in our states, because there are a lot of things that can happen in your community in fairly short order. Unfortunately, it took this young woman to die for us and for those in Louisville to address no-knock warrants. But this is a problem with this policy writ large. Not only is it a violation of civil liberties, we know that when these no-knock warrants come to pass, it usually harms those people who are having their homes raided. Unfortunately, we've seen it all over this country, and it shouldn't take something like this for us to say this is an issue and we need to take a step back. But that it did, and that we did have a city council with a conscience and a community of activists who were going to hold them accountable, makes a lot of sense. And I think you're right, Roland. We often fetishize the federal government, but the federal government has real limits. And when we look at things like police control and things like that, that's a local issue. That's a state issue. And that's something that you can get a lot more fast acting policies put through than you can with what you have to deal with in Congress. So, I hope more people recognize the power of local action. And start thinking about that more often. And it's often a set of offices that many of these young people who are active in the streets can also aspire to and reach. And I think that's something we should also be encouraging as well for this cadre of activists and others to also think about those local communities as places where they can have a seat at the table and really think about and push forward policies that they want to change and get the people elected that are actually going to work in their best interest in their everyday lives.
Rob?
It just shows the power of a moment and the power of the people really on the ground. And you guys have already really stated that, but I do want to just make sure that it's just amazing that we've gotten to this point. You know, no-knock warrants are a common thing that happen everywhere, and people were accepting this as if it was okay. I mean, obviously, the people on this panel were. I've been talking about it for years. You know, Roland, you've been talking about it for years, and we know about it. It happens in our communities, but most people are like, this is something that law enforcement needs to do, and it was always aired on the side of law enforcement needs to do this in order to protect people, but they don't. Mm-hmm. And this is not even about protecting people. This is about abusing their power, and people can see that. And it's so sad that Breonna Taylor had to die, but there's a lot of Breonna Taylors that have died too. And so at least there's somebody who's recognizing that our lives are valuable. These things need to stop. And on the second point, the protest has definitely made a difference. And now we need to continue to move forward for policy, because protest only works when it's connected to sustainable policy. And this is the beginning of that. And I hope people see that they can make a difference at their local level. We need them to get involved. And you know what? It's more important who your mayor is, who your prosecutor is, and who your president is. So our voices matter, our votes matter. I hope people understand that in this moment and keep pushing forward, because a lot more reform is needed.
Well, I won't say it's more important. I say they all are important because they all serve different purposes for all of us. All right, folks, back to that Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. Amazing headphones, 360-degree headphones, 4D. Gamers love them. I love them with music. Of course, you can even talk on them. They're Bluetooth. Just great set of headphones. We have a great partnership with them. If you go to Ceek.com, Ceek.com, use this promo code RMVIP2020, RMVIP2020, for you to be able to check these, to get these headphones. And so, yeah, real cool. They're great. So if y'all going to be out there and you're buying JBL and Bose and the rest of these companies, hey, you might as well support a black-owned company with these headphones. Ceek.com, Ceek.com. And again, promo code is RMVIP2020, RMVIP2020.